You are listening to Essence, a podcast about story, journey, and self. Hello and welcome to Essence, a podcast about journey, story, and self. I am, of course, Ben Stimpson, and Essence is a part of Paduka Wellness, my private counseling practice located in Kitchener, Ontario, Canada. On today's show, and I have to be honest, this is one of my favorite interviews that I've done so far. I have Mhara Starling. Mhara is a Welsh witch. She is a TikTok and social media influencer. Now, at the time of this recording, we couldn't say what the book was or even what it was about, but I can now say Mhara's book that she talks about is coming out in February 2022. It's available through Llewellyn, and so she's a forthcoming author, and her book is Welsh Witchcraft, A Guide to the Spirits, Lore, and Magic of Wales. Now, I felt a real bond with Mhara even before I had a chance to actually sit down and talk to her. We shared a few comments here and there on our Facebook pages, spoke a little bit through Messenger, but I hadn't actually really sat down and talked to her. And I felt a real bond because where Mhara is from in Wales is only about an hour from where I was born. And so, we have a similar kind of connection to the same landscape in many ways. And what I love about what Mhara is about to talk about is she talks about not only writing from that place of connection to the land, but also what it's been like for her to write on a subject that is, of course, very close to her heart, something that she's been exploring for many years now. But to speak about that topic in such a way that it's accessible for other people. I really have to be honest, I very much appreciated how vulnerable Mhara went with this interview. She was a very open book, and although there were certain pieces that we didn't go into, I definitely felt like Mhara was willing to go to where into those deep places, and so it was a very satisfying interview to have, and something that I have to be honest, I resonated a lot with what Mhara was saying. Throughout this interview, you'll see some wonderful insight into not only what it's been like for her to write this book, but also what her journey so far has been like as both a Welsh person living in the UK, as a Welsh witch. She's shared some observations about what it has been like to almost become very popular around that identity, and some of the pushback that she's received because of that. I will place, of course, down in the show notes, whether or not you're listening to this on YouTube or if you're listening to this on a podcast server, all of the details of Mhara's stuff down in the show notes. I do highly recommend going and following her if you're interested in paganism or witchcraft or even Welsh identity and culture. Please do go down there. And so, without further ado, let's get into the interview. There we go. That works now. Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome an amazing individual onto the show today, Mhara Starling, from currently in Chester, in England, in Cheshire, but originally from Ynys in Wales. And Wales, of course, as you can see, my lovely home. So Mhara is... I don't know where to start with you. You've done so much in such a small amount of time. Mhara is a television personality. She has been seen in the past couple of years, first Young Welsh and Pretty Religious, a short mini-series for BBC about religious young people in Wales, in modern Wales today. She appeared in Apparitions in 2019, Trip Hazard on Channel 4, and a couple of projects that we can't talk about yet. Mhara is also a writer. She has a forthcoming book out, which again we can't talk much about, but it's worth a mention. She is a YouTube and other social media personality, and a lot of Mhara's work is around Welsh witchcraft and exploring the traditional roots of Welsh witchcraft, as opposed to other forms of witchcraft, more popularly Wicca, or the traditional witchcraft of England, and all around. Really, and a bookseller as well. You're a bookseller too. You've got a lot going on, Mhara.
Quite a bit, yes.
So I first became aware of your work last year. Somebody forwarded me your YouTube channel, and then I understood that we had a mutual friend, somebody who's very, very close to you. So, I mean, you've had a real journey over the past couple of years, and in the past, I would say probably 6 months, 7 months, you've really kind of shown up to the community. Describe a little bit about your spiritual practice, kind of how you got into it.
So, growing up on the Isle of Anglesey, I was obviously surrounded by folklore and so much beautiful landscapes. It was very difficult to look around on the Isle of Anglesey, like growing up in a tiny little place called Aberfraw, which is just on the coast. It was difficult not to look around and feel like there was something more to life than, the basics of what we're told life is. And I was part of a Christian community, but at the same time, most of the people around me, my family, they weren't Christian. They didn't really care so much about church and stuff. It was almost as if the church in our community was just a place to go and shows or have some parties at Christmas and such. Whereas, yeah, my mum, she didn't really believe in any of that stuff, and she was very vocal about that throughout my upbringing. She was very like, I don't really believe in God or Jesus or anything like that. So I was quite lucky compared to some, really, in that regard, in that like my mum didn't really care for it. There were occasions when they brought it up, the religion and such, especially with my grandparents who were more religious, but I didn't have any kind of conditioning to believe any specific thing. And my grandmother was actually a diviner, you might say. She read the crystal ball. She read I think she might have read tarot cards, and she also definitely read tea leaves. And so I heard all those stories growing up, and I remember seeing my grandmother's crystal ball sat on her desk and stuff. And she was always referred to as the witch of the family because she did these things and she had these long fingernails. And she'd always come up to the car when we arrived at her house and tap on the windows with her fingernails. And she was lovely. And
Like
she
a very
died when I
Mystic
was
Meg character, right?
yes, she's quite the character. And like growing up surrounded by her, I built this fascination with witchcraft and magic and fairies specifically as well. I loved fairies as a kid, and my teachers used to refer to me as the one who likes fairies, mermaids, and witches. And so like I always had a fascination with all these things, especially when I came across Welsh folklore and Welsh mythology, the stories of the Mabinogi. Growing up in a Welsh-speaking community, we were taught these things from a very, very young age. I remember doing a play on the story of Branwen and feeling really like a kinship with the character of Branwen and how she just overcame so much but still died in the end. And I was like,
And
oh
close
wow,
to where you come from is
yeah,
art, right?
yeah. So Branwen, according to the legend, I think this is why we were taught so much about it in school. But Branwen actually got married in Aberfraw, which is where I was from, and in the tale in the Mabinogi. So like growing up with all these things surrounding me, it was kind of inevitable that I would eventually just fall in love with myth and magic and folklore and witchcraft. And witchcraft kind of came quite hard at me from a very young age, because when I was about 12 years old, I found a book in a charity shop called Spells for Teenage Witches. And at first I bought it because I thought, oh, this is like a quirky little book. I used to love collecting the little books like dragonology and Egyptology and things like that. And I thought, oh, this is like a fantasy book about witches and it's going to be really fun. But then upon reading it, I was like, oh, this talks about spirituality and Wicca and paganism and all these things. And that kind of started my little journey into witchcraft. And I was actually taught in school by a mutual friend of mine and Christopher Hughes's, a lady called, I'll just call her Miss Franklin here, but and she used to come to the school and teach us art, and everyone used to say she's a witch, she's a witch. And I used to be like, yeah, whatever, and I'll get to her later. But she she kind of used to also help us create artwork based on Welsh folklore and stuff. And, learning about witchcraft through this book, this Spells for Teenage Witches book, I instantly developed this desire to make myself into a witch. And so I started practicing a lot of the spells in there. But even from a young age, I think I noticed in that book that there were elements in there that, and I think a lot of witches can relate to this, that when you read your first ever witchcraft book, a lot of it is you going, well, I already do that. And it's kind of intuitive. And wow, this book speaks to me on another level. And that's kind of what happened, because growing up, my version of praying was always to go stand on the cliffs that overlooked the Snowdon Mountains. And I would just stand there in the wind with my arms upraised, and I would say, I call to the spirits of the land, like, hear me, all the ghosts that reside in this area, and make my dreams come true. And so, like, when I read the first witchcraft book I ever had, I thought to myself, oh gosh, I already do this. Maybe I already am a witch. And yeah, eventually that led to me meeting Chris. And then I developed myself into a Welsh pagan or witch, and incorporated a lot of these myths and legends that I grew up with into my spiritual practice.
Yes. What I love what you just described very succinctly there is that connection to land, and that connect. I mean, growing up, I remember driving down the A55. We were just an hour down, and driving into Snowdonia and seeing that landscape. Like vivid memories of like turning that corner and then suddenly Penman Mawr is right there, right? Seeing that landscape. It's a very easy landscape to feel that old reverberation. But you took it a step further, and you took what this little book, as you say, your little journey, you took what was in these books and really applied it to your landscape.
Yeah, so I just saw kind of that. I think I saw that in the stories that we were being taught in school, that these stories were embedded into the land itself and were part of not only the culture and the identity of Wales, but also the land. And I don't try not to like toot my own horn, but I think like I picked up on that from a really young age. And I think that really propelled me to start delving into a more kind of pagan spirituality that was based on the land.
Yeah, yeah. And part of your journey, of course, there's multiple other parts to that journey too. Part of that journey was also to come to terms with other, like your gender identity, for example. And I mean, now living in a predominantly English-speaking area, coming to terms also with being fluent in Welsh too. Can you speak a little bit about that? Because that's a really interesting part of your journey, and I'm really curious about that piece.
Yeah, I think a lot of people underestimate just how much my identity plays a role in who I am. And I did grow up in a really rural area. If there's any listeners from America speaking, I always think like when people think of where I'm from, I think they imagine this like beautiful fantasy Celtic landscape that's like filled with fairies and like red-haired women running down the beach on a white horse. And they imagine that kind of fantasy thing. But really, if I were to compare where I lived growing up to anywhere, it would be like the Bible Belt in America, where people do have these conservative, like quote unquote backwards views. And I did grow up with people like my dad and my brother. Whenever like gay people would turn up on the television, like if there was a gay kiss on a soap opera or something, they would literally like gag. And I don't mean gagging as in like I'm gagging, I mean like gagging as in like bleh, I don't like this is gross. And so it was kind of like a huge part of my childhood, like growing up with people treating anyone that was different as weird and unusual and someone to avoid. I kind of knew from that very young age that I was already different. And my dad kind of picked up on that as well, I think. And so did my grandmother, the grandmother I said that was referred to as a witch by everyone. She used to kind of really push that weird individualistic side of me, because all this interests I had in like mermaids and witches and fairies, which are kind of weird interests for a young boy, quote unquote, growing up in Wales. I didn't really have any interest in things like football or rugby or anything like that the other boys were interested in. I was there reading my books about mermaids and fairies and playing with dolls and things like that. And coming out as gay originally. I came out as gay when I was 13. I told my parents that I liked boys and I don't like girls in that way. And it was quite difficult because I didn't really feel accepted, especially not by my dad or by my brothers. My sister and my mother were absolutely amazing from the get-go. They just instantly said to me, "Oh, we already know, like we already know, and we accept you for what you are." But then, school as well was absolutely difficult because I was surrounded by people who did grow up on farms and like with parents who also had the same views as my dad. And so I got used to being bullied and things. And I think growing up, I disconnected from the fact that I was Welsh because I connected Welshness to those people who were, as I would think now, backwards in their thinking. We called them, upon Anglesey, we called them Joskins. And Joskin just means like anyone who kind of grew up on a farm or in a rural area and, is very kind of boyish and the Joskins, and then they would be the bullies in my school, the ones who were really horrible and would say horrible and nasty things. And I couldn't go around a corner in school without somebody saying something nasty to me or throwing something at me or threatening me or anything like that. And growing up with that, I kind of related like, oh, Wales equals this torment. And I almost instantly came to this idea that I must leave. I have to leave eventually. And I'm quite glad that in my teen years, then I met Chris, who, not only was he a druid and a pagan and had the same interest in these kind of spiritual things and the aspects of the magic of the landscape that I was interested in, but he was also an out and proud gay man, and he was also a drag queen. And I think he kind of inspired me a lot when I was a teenager, because I did meet him when I was 16, I think, at that like pivotal time when I was leaving school and going to college and starting to find myself. And then I think he helped me reconnect with the idea that, Wales is not bigotry. Wales is so much more than that. And then, I think a lot of people, like I said, underestimate just how much that affected who I am today. And it's almost like I feel like I'm reconnecting with my Welshness through my spiritual practice, my magical practice. Yeah.
That's a really powerful point, because I mean, to step into this place of reclaiming traditional approaches and practices, and we were talking before about becoming okay with those Christian components to Welsh culture, because I mean, a lot of my North American viewers will not really understand that bit in between Scotland, Wales, and England, and how, especially in Welsh speaking culture, it's very saturated with Methodism. It's very saturated with the church. My experience of the Anglo Welsh culture is very much like England. It's you go to church 3 times a year, maybe. It's very very agnostic. But especially in the rural communities, you go to church every single Sunday. It's not a question of that. And a very practical thing that people will do is pray for you, and all of these things. So you met Chris 16. You started to develop kind of a reconnection with your Welsh identity, and then you moved to England.
Yeah.
What has it been like for you to be in England? I mean, Chester isn't that far away from Wales, but like it's a completely different world in many ways. What is it like for you to not only be a Welsh person, but be a Welsh witch in England, kind of having that outsider's view a little bit when you go back?
So, like, growing up Welsh, I mean, you already kind of feel like you're not really sure what your identity is, because you have the world telling you, you're just a part of England, you're not a real country, and things like that. And that was really that really stood out to me when I moved to England originally, because I do live in Chester now, but I originally moved to Crewe, which is a little town. And I originally moved to Crewe for university. So I applied for Manchester Metropolitan University and I got in. And then they told me, but the campus is in Crewe, by the way. You're at the Cheshire campus in Crewe. And I was like, I thought I'd be in Manchester. Because like I said, my initial kind of desire when I was growing up was to leave Wales, because I kind of made that connection that Wales equals the bigotry. And it's only now that I'm starting to unload that kind of trauma, I guess, that I have from growing up being bullied and misunderstood. But when I first moved to Crewe and first moved to university specifically, because I lived on campus, I lived in student halls, I think something that really stood out to me, and I'm not sure if every Welsh person would feel this way, but I just couldn't connect with a lot of the English people in the university, like the people I lived with. I was fortunate in that, like, I moved into a block of flats with, there was 3 English people, I think, and then 2 of the people in my flat were international students. So one of them was French and one of them was Dutch. And I connected more to the French and the Dutch individuals than I did the English. And they found that strange too, because these 2 individuals, these 2 girls that I became friends with, they didn't even know Wales existed outside of, like, you know, that it might just be a part of England. So they didn't realize we had a language and a culture that was different. And we started talking and we realized that there's a lot of similarities between, you know, being a continental European and being Welsh. And I didn't realize that until I moved there. I thought I would relate more to the people who grew up in the UK, you know, seeing as that was my identity. But I think the biggest kind of thing that really shook me when I moved was how I couldn't really connect to the landscape in the same way. And I still can't. I still struggle really, really intensely. I mean, a lot of my personal witchcraft is about connecting to your locale, your region. And, you know, Chester, where I live now, Chester is such a gorgeous city with so much history and culture. And I keep trying to connect to that. I'm like, oh, you know, we've got these Roman shrines and there's even some Celtic aspects in this city, but I still just can't for some reason. There's just this weird block where I just can't seem to fully immerse myself in it. And I try and like learn about the Roman gods that are seen on murals and shrines here in the city, and I try and connect to the history of the place, but just nothing seems to speak to me as much as being home was. I mean, at home, I had these cliffs, like I said, that overlooked the Snowdon Mountains. We had Bad Cloded y Gawres, which is a burial chamber only down the road at Port Trecastell. And then we also had a cairn, the Trwyn the cairn, on the cliffs that overlooked the mountains in my village, and all these different standing stones and things dotted around the Isle of Anglesey. And those things played such a pivotal role in who I became as a witch. I mean, I still remember being 15, 16, 17 and going to like Newborough Forest or to Barcode de Gaudes or Bryn Cylliddu or Trevignath, all these like sacred sites, these ancient monuments, and connecting to them and going with all these like witches and pagans and going with the Anglesey Druid Order sometimes, or sometimes with my little working group, and just dancing the night away, you know, sitting under the moon. And I've tried doing those things here in England, and it just doesn't feel the same. And I don't know if that's my own block or if it's that it is my kind of ancestry and my culture calling to me more. But yeah, that was the biggest kind of shock to my system, was that how difficult I would find it. And I think a lot of people, especially those who don't come from Wales, really underestimate how different of a world it is moving from a rural part of Wales to England, to a city in England as well.
No, it's absolutely true. I'm listening to you and I'm resonating a lot. Like so I moved from Wales when I was 8, but I've been back since. My sister actually lives just about 20 minutes up the road from you, and so she lives in a place called Harden, which is Ulo, just south of Deeside. And as soon as you come down the hill and you're coming straight to, like, you know, Broughton Shopping Centre, you see how flat the land suddenly becomes. And it's flat all the way until you hit, like, you know, the Yorkshire Dales, right? Like, there's a few hills here and there, but as soon as you go back into Wales, suddenly you get that beautiful rolling landscape. And you can imagine, like, last time I was over, I was down in Llangollen, and you can imagine, you know, the mystery of that place, because you're nestled in that landscape. And I mean, being in Canada here, I've experienced the same thing. Like I've still only just now, after 25 years, started to feel like certain parts of Ontario are home. You know, it really does. That connection to land is huge, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always kind of joke with my partner because we have a favorite woods that we go walking to, and I always joke with him like it's really sad that the only time I feel connected to the landscape here in England is when I go deep into the woods where
Yes.
I could be in Wales, you know. And it's like, oh, you know, you couldn't really tell the difference between being in those woods to being in, say, Newbury Forest or Penrose up in Anglesey, and those are the only times I feel like I'm somewhat close to what I had when I was back home.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah.
it's funny. It's and especially I feel like my personal theory is when you're working with a piece of land that's been inhabited for so long. I mean, like North America's been inhabited for so long too, but it's a different connection because you know obviously my people are not the indigenous people. But when you're working with a piece of land like the UK and different parts, um, you know, it's only been in the past 150 years that people have moved around all over the place. You know, and so that piece around you know going into the deep woods, which looks very similar to the deep woods back home. You know, there's something in that. There's definitely something in that. I want to ask you about your witchcraft now, because you know when people hear the word witch, they might get certain images in their head. Wicca, you know, certainly the kind of the pop culture form. Um, what does witchcraft mean for you? Because I know that in Wales, the traditional conception of witch is very different, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, originally when I first came into witchcraft, I was immersed. I think it's impossible to come into witchcraft, modern witchcraft in any capacity and not be influenced by, you know, Wicca in some way. It's such a pivotal like religion that's really grasped onto the cultural consciousness, especially here in Britain. It's such like a huge aspect of witchcraft in its modern form today. And I mean, even in my own practice today, there are still elements that I can definitely look back at and think that's from Wicca, definitely. Like, you know, I still call to the elements and I still do things like that. And I still kind of set up an altar in my home because that is how I started. But so when I met Chris at 16, I met Chris via, originally I sent an email to the Anglesey Druid Order asking like, hey, I want to know more, as a curious teenager. And Chris actually messaged me back because I put like, I'm one of those people who writes essays when I write messages.
I feel you on this one.
So I included all this information in the email, like I live in Aberfraw and I love this and I love witchcraft and blah blah blah. And Chris actually got back to me personally and said, you know, like I live just down the road from you. Why don't we meet up one day and maybe we can chat through some things and I can tell you more about the Druid Order and how we operate and things like that because I'm actually the chief. And I was like, oh my gosh, the chief of the Anglesey Druid Order has invited me
What's
around.
to me?
I felt so special. And yeah, I got off the bus one day from college a bit sooner because, like I said, I didn't live too far from Chris. I got off the bus from college and went to see him and sat with him, and we sat and talked about the Mabinogi and Welsh folklore and magic and witchcraft. And he really opened my eyes to the idea that, because up until that point, I'd been practicing, like I said, I'd found that book in a charity shop when I was 12 years old. So I'd technically been practicing witchcraft since that age because I was following this book and the things that it was teaching me. And then I bought things like Scott Cunningham's book on Wicca for the solitary practitioner. And I think I bought some books from Vivian Crowley and all sorts. And I was reading these very kind of Wicca leaning books. So my witchcraft was very much based on that originally and inspired by people like Kate West and the kind of just generic level, surface level witchcraft that you can find if you go to W.H. Smith or Waterstones or whatever it is in America to
For both
buy
of
as
those
well.
bookstores, by the way.
Yeah, to go to any of the bookstores and pick up like one of those books. And that was my witchcraft. It was very much, I had an elemental altar set up in my living room with a pentacle in the middle and things like that. Not my living room, it was my bedroom back then I was a teenager. But then when I met Chris and he was discussing all these things with me, I kind of instantly fell in love with how passionate he was for Wales, how passionate he was for the mythology and lore of magic that is in our culture as Welsh people. And it instantly like initiated this journey for me of discovering more. And I mean, originally I glumped onto the concept of Ceridwen, the archetype of the witch in Wales, and looked at things like the very kind of bardic traditions of magic. And then as I kind of progressed, I met a few more witches. I joined a lot of kind of little working groups and moots. And there was this one witch in particular who I mentioned earlier, Miss Franklin, who was also kind of a practicing witch who lived in the area. And she introduced me to the idea of traditional witchcraft, which of course is very much English in nature. When you read about any of the kind of books that are out, from like whether you go back to the Cochrane kind of traditional witchcraft, or whether you're reading the more modern kind of aspects of folk magic and folk traditional witchcraft. And I came across the works of people like Gemma Gary and Nigel Pearson and things like that. And I kind of read those things and instantly felt this connection to this idea of witchcraft and folk magic. And I thought, well, we must have that in Wales. We must have something like that in Wales. And oh my goodness, that started a roller coaster journey. Because obviously, like you said, the concept of the witch in Wales is vastly different from the English concept of a witch. I mean, if you look at the historical concept or the folkloric concept of the witch in England, it's very much this creature of benevolence, this not benevolence, malevolence even.
Malevolence, yes,
Yeah, it's this creature of malevolence, and it's very much the devil and hell, and it's very rooted in Christian lore. And I mean, there are aspects of witch lore in Wales that you can see are influenced by that, specifically from the borderlands or from areas that were highly anglicized. But then when you look at the lore of witches in more rural areas, such as where I'm from, the concept of the witch was very, very different. And it was almost as if, I mean, when I started studying into folk magic of Wales, then I started reading about the witch trials in Wales and how there really weren't any here. There weren't really proper witch trials in Wales. There were more witch trials per county in England than there were in the entire of Wales as a country. And that, I think, says a lot about what the people of Old Wales thought of witchcraft. Like, they just did not see it as this completely malevolent thing. And the concept of witchcraft didn't really exist. But what we did have was Swyn Gyfaredd and Consirio and, all these different kind of traditions of magic that now, I mean, Swyn Gyfaredd, a lot of people, when they talk about Swyn Gyfaredd, they translate it to be, oh, it's the Welsh version of charming. Now, of course, Scotland, England, everywhere has charmers, and the people who would go around the village kind of giving out charms for healing and protection. But
cunning.
Sorry?
Cunning.
Yeah, the cunning folk and such. And I kind of listen to these people who make these connections between charming and Swyn Gyfaredd, and I go, no, there's a bit of a difference, because the people, the Swynydd, the ones who practiced Swyn Gyfaredd in their communities, they weren't just learned in charms. So like charms, for example, were very much a traditional thing that was passed down through the family. You'd be passed down these various charms, and we had them in Welsh, the swynion. But the people who actually practiced these swynion, these charms, they were learned in so much more as well. They were usually learned in herbal healing. We have a whole tradition of herbal healing in Wales from the physicians of Myddfai and such. And then they were also learned in things like astrology and often occultism. So it was almost like the Swynydd of Wales were like this really weird meeting place between the English idea of charmers, cunning folk, and witches all in one, because they did practice malevolent magic sometimes too. I mean, it wasn't too hard to find somebody in Wales who would place a curse on your enemy for you. And I mean, cursing was a huge part of the tradition here in Wales. So my kind of concept of what being a witch means has evolved slowly and gradually over time to mean that folk magical practitioner who kind of exists in the liminal spaces, like not good, not bad, not the type of person who will go around blatantly cursing you for no reason, but also not the type of person who will take any crap. And I guess my concept of the witch is, I think, very different from a lot of other people who refer to themselves as a Celtic witch, because I think what a lot of people, and this is not shade, I'm not trying to be shady when I say this,
No, no.
but I think a lot of people, when they think of what a Celtic witch is, what a Welsh witch is, they simply take the works of, say, Iolo Morgannwg and the Bardic tradition, and they just add witchcraft to it. And it's like, or by witchcraft, I mean like Wicca witchcraft, modern witchcraft. They just add, like the calling to the elements and setting up an altar and using a cauldron. And it's like, oh, it's a Celtic witch. Whereas to me, I kind of see my witchcraft as being fully inspired and informed by the traditional magical practices that were part of Welsh communities. And I think a lot of people find that jarring because there is so much Christianity found within folk magic. I mean, there are spells that date back to like the 17th century that we have recordings of that have really archaic writings in there where they talk about like power of stones and the power of elemental forces like the winds and the seas, but then they also call upon Jesus, Mary, and all these saints and such. And I think a lot of people find that jarring because I do believe that a lot of people come to paganism and witchcraft almost as a rebellion to being Christian. And I mean, I certainly felt that when I was young. I had this really intense rebellion against anything Christian, and anything Christian I would kind of shut off from and be like, nope. And it's only in the recent years when I've started incorporating a lot of these traditional folk magical practices into my practice that I've come to understanding that, the culture of Wales has been Christian for so many years now, for well over 1,000 years, that of course it would play a role in the traditional folk magical practices. Of course it would, because at the end of the day, most of the folk magical practitioners, they sold their services, they sold spells, they sold curses, they sold jars with all sorts of things, or herbal tinctures and such. And if you were going to give a spell of protection to a Christian, well, it wouldn't mean anything if it had a prayer to Taliesin on there, but if it has a prayer to Jesus, then they're going to see it as working because they believe in that. And I think that helps me kind of see my path as being very crooked, I suppose. A lot of people call their path the crooked path, but I see my path as specifically crooked because it does kind of switch from being, I'm very much interested in paganism, Celtic paganism, the Druidic bardic side of it's a huge part of our cultural heritage, but also the Christianity is as well. So I kind of flip back and forth between these Christian folk magical traditions and then the Celtic paganism. So being a witch to me just means being somebody who is inspired and informed by the magic of my landscape and all magic, not just the pre-Christian magic, but also the magic of my nearer ancestors who lived in the 17th, 18th, and 19th and 20th centuries.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. So in that, there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot in
Yeah.
I want to pick up on a couple and comment because it's very true. I feel like in modern neo-paganism, there's an or and, right? It's this or that. You're either pre-Christian or Christian, right? And the reality is that when you look at traditional practices, even traditional cultures, like one of my major interests is medieval folklore. And you don't have a cunning folk selling to Christians. You have Christian cunning folk selling to other people in their community. There's no separation of that, right? And people don't. I feel like a lot of people, like you said, they're coming from that kind of rebellion. They may have trauma growing up as in Christian communities. Certainly, I've experienced homophobia in my Christian community over here. Coming to paganism and wanting to have that kind of separation without being triggered, right? But it's a lot more complicated than that. And I don't think that that's necessary. I mean, this is no shade either, but I don't think that's a healthy way of looking at things. But I've certainly evolved in my own practices similar to that. There's also a piece in there, and I'm glad that you raised it, because so one of the big issues in North America, of course, is indigenous issues, and the way that the indigenous peoples of North America have been put into the past. So people will, when they think of the Native American, they think of the people from 150 years ago. in many ways, Welsh people, even Scots Gaelic, Irish people, the same experience, have been put into the past. I feel like a lot of people who come to this concept of Celtic paganism always look back to y Mabinogi. They don't look at the tradition that evolved out of that, and they forget, or they don't even see that actually Christianity in Wales predates Christianity in England, right? The Christianity, the Celtic Church in Wales was established by the Romans and never left, right? Like Saint Dafydd was a Roman, right? There's no disconnection there. I was very, very lucky to grow up quite close by to Holywell, which is the church in Holywell, St. Winifred's. And when you go into that shrine and you go into that, the sanctuary where her spring is, you feel all the ancestors around you, right? You know, it's an amazing experience, and it doesn't speak to a pre-Christian past. It doesn't speak to a Christian past. It speaks to that unified past, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
And I think that separation is really like something that, for me personally, I dealt with a lot, because it's like I said earlier, I put Wales and the bigotry and trauma that I faced for being who I was into the same category. And I was like, oh, it's Wales's fault that I've done this. And I think a lot of people do the same with Christianity. You know, like I said, I was fortunate to grow up without any severely Christian parents or anything. So I don't think I have as much of the trauma with Christianity. But with my community, you know, being Welsh is very much seen as this kind of farming, rural, you know, in some ways Christian kind of way of living, where everything is quite conservative, and you know, you can't be gay, can't be weird, can't be anything like that. I think there was a part of me that had to come to the realization that I created that, you know, correlation in my head. And maybe it wasn't fair of me to blame Wales for the problem that people pushed upon me. So I think maybe that's one of the reasons why I can look at the Christian folk magical traditions and still see them as valid parts of my own spiritual tradition today, without thinking about the, you know, the negatives of what Christianity has brought forth for many people like me growing up. And yeah, and like you say, the connection to the people as well, because when I think of the Celtic Church in Wales, it's very much a very different feel to the English church, the Church of England, and you know, the horrid things that they kind of did. When I think of the Church of England, I do kind of think of the colonialism and also the witch hunts and those things, as well as the modern day like homophobia and bigotry. But when I think of the churches in Wales, all I think about is community and being at one with the people and the land and your community and your space, your people. So I think it's easier for me to think of it from that way. And yeah, you're definitely right. There is this obsession with romanticizing the past, especially in pagan circles. And I think people need to realize that, you know, a lot of these nations that people look at as the Celtic nations now, they're places with real people still living there, still growing up, and still dealing with their own lives. So we're not kind of skipping through meadows with leprechauns.
It's true. No, it's absolutely true. A person I know, not a friend of mine, but a person I know, asked once for Celtic music. So I sent them a link very publicly to Goldie Looking Chain, and they were not amused. They're like, "What's this?" I mean, but that's the thing. I feel like this is not, again, not shade, but I feel like people who are not from the UK, or not, when you're not from Europe or you're not from a place, it's very easy to only see what you want to see, or you know, it's filtered. So to many North Americans, the only thing they hear about Wales or Scotland or Ireland is that kind of, you know, my ancestors were from there from 300 years ago, and that's what it still is like now. And they don't see the place as it real. To be fair, though, the UK, they've done the same thing to Italy, to Greece, to, you know, Spain. I think it's a very natural thing when you've never actually been to a place, so you only go there and you only see it for, you know, you like people going and seeing only the castles, you know, like if you It always makes me laugh when people go to Wales and they say, "Oh, the Welsh must love all these big, beautiful castles." Yeah, yeah, we do.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's big conversations happening as well online lately. I'm very fortunate to have found a really nice little community with my TikTok community, because TikTok was kind of the first place that I really went viral, quote unquote, with my work. I mean, I tried YouTube and such, and I will be getting back into YouTube this year to talk about things in more depth. But TikTok was the place that I found any sort of sense of community. And one of the first people that I came into contact with on there was actually a lady by the name of Celtic Shan. And her work is absolutely glorious to me, because she's Cornish and she talks about, Cornish culture in some ways. I mean, I talk a lot about how Wales has been delegated to being seen as just another part of England. But I mean, how difficult must it be for Cornish people who are proud of the fact that they are Cornish to then be told, well, actually, Cornwall is literally part of England. It's not even its own country. It's a Celtic nation by definition, but it's also part of England, and it's seen as a part of England. So she talks a lot about how she struggles with people not understanding how she doesn't really identify herself as English. She's Cornish through and through. But something else we chatted about a lot right at the beginning when I first came to TikTok was we talked about how there's this almost, with the romanticization of the past and such, and this forgetting that there are people living in these areas today. There's also this, I noticed this big problem straight away when I came onto TikTok, and it was people who are from America or even Australia. I saw a couple of people from Australia or Canada or anything like that who have ancestors that came from here. There's this huge problem lately with them almost like talking over people who actually grew up and live in the communities, and acting as if they have some kind of, and I mean, it's terrible with Ireland especially. There's a lot of people online who, because I think there's a huge kind of Irish American movement going on, where people almost talk over what it's like to live there when they've never even stepped foot on the country themselves or grown up there. And there's huge discussions at the minute about what it means to be Celtic, because I never saw being Celtic as a genetic thing. I always saw it as a cultural thing. So if you didn't grow up with a Celtic culture surrounding you, then I don't really see you as Celtic. And a lot of people say, like, you're mean for that. I have Celtic ancestry. And it's like, yeah, but did you grow up with a Celtic language or a Celtic, any of these aspects of the culture that makes our communities what they are? Because I mean, there's a huge difference between having Celtic ancestry, in my eyes, to actually growing up in a community that speaks Welsh every single day as their first language. And I mean, I've gotten in trouble a few times, I think, with a lot of the diaspora and people that are from across the seas who have this romanticized view of their ancestry and their past. And I mean, I would never deny them their identity. If they see themselves as as Welsh American or Irish American, then yes, that's beautiful. But at the same time, I think it's important to listen to the people who actually grew up in that culture, because there's so much more to being Welsh or Irish or Scottish or Cornish or any of the Celtic nations than just mythology and paganism.
That's exactly it, right? I mean, there is, speaking to people over here, as soon as I say I'm Welsh, and like, I mean, to be honest, my parents are English, I have Welsh ancestry, but I'm Welsh because I was born there, right? But like, I didn't grow up in a Welsh school. My niece does, because she's she's fluent. But it is true, and as soon as you say that, suddenly you can just see all of the the lens of, oh, you must love the Queen, oh, you must do this, and then it suddenly doesn't become a discussion about you, it becomes a discussion about those ideas, right? So let's talk about that then, because you are stepping into that place of facilitating, I would say, a reasonable view of what being a modern Welsh person in these spiritual traditions are like. I mean, in 2019, you were on Young Welsh and Pretty Religious. This is exactly what we're talking about here. Tell me a little bit about that process. What was that like for you to put yourself out there like that?
I think
huge discussion.
I always kind of had this desire to put myself out there, because, like I said, I've been active on social media for so many years. and I think when I found my niche of talking about Wales specifically and talking about, my culture, the things that I grew up with, and also these aspects of my practice that are very personal to me, I really wanted to share them. But I think I'm getting lately very overwhelmed with like the image. I mean, I always thought that Wales was very niche and that nobody really cared about us, because especially like going to university and hearing people from other countries literally say, I didn't know your country existed, or I didn't know your country was a country. I thought it was a county in England. Hearing people say things like that, you instantly grow up thinking, well, nobody really cares. And I mean, I definitely went down the route originally on Instagram of trying to be like, one of those Insta witches who just post pictures of their altars and try to gain some semblance of community via that. And then, when I posted my little videos on TikTok about Welsh paganism, uh, and they took off so much, it was really overwhelming to see like how many people really absolutely want to hear about this stuff. And now I'm just like, I'm quite happy that I did it, because originally, first and foremost, the whole reason I decided to do it was because I couldn't find anything myself. I couldn't find any semblance of what it's like to be a Welsh witch or a Welsh pagan beyond, like the two or three sources that exist. And a lot of the sources that I did find were not Welsh. Like there was a lot of books and such that came out that were written about Welsh folklore, Welsh myth, Welsh magic, or Welsh druidism and paganism that were actually written by Americans or even English people sometimes. And that was very jarring to me. And so I got frustrated and I was like, I want to hear more. And then I got told by someone very close to me, she said to me, well, if you can't find anything and you're looking for an authentic voice on Welsh witchcraft and Welsh paganism, why don't you become that voice? Why don't you make it your quest to find the information and put it out there for everyone? And I'm glad that people are resonating with it. I'm glad that I'm helping. I hope anyway. I've been told by some people that I help their practice and I help them find information and such. And that's my goal, is to just educate and inform and help people find this stuff if they are looking for it. But yeah, there is this overwhelming feeling of, oh my gosh, I'm almost representing this now. Like when I go on TikTok and I see that my videos have had like 800,000 views and things, and I'm just like, oh my goodness, I'm really in the public eye. And now every move I make is going to be watched by people, and that can be overwhelming. But also, like as a Welsh woman and a Welsh witch, I think I have this almost feeling now that I have to represent my culture very well, because I have come into situations where people have been almost offended at the fact that I'm presenting my version of Welsh witchcraft. And instead of perceiving it as I'm presenting my version, my journey, they see it as me trying to speak for everyone. I've had a few Welsh witches come into conversation with me and they've said things like, oh my goodness, your witchcraft looks nothing like mine. Are you saying I'm not a Welsh witch? And I'm like, no, I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying I'm a Welsh witch. This is how I practice. And I am informed and inspired by the traditional magical practices of Wales. And this is how I found what I found. But some people will very much project their own insecurities onto that and try and assume that I'm trying to speak over everyone. So it's such a mixed bag. There's so much going on, and I sometimes I wake up and I'm just like, I can't deal with all of this. And especially because I almost built up this persona on TikTok, especially on my YouTube. My YouTube is a very kind of chilled place where I just sit usually on the sofa and just chat and tell people about these things. But on TikTok, I went out one morning and I did a video all about the physicians of Mudvi
Oh,
and
yeah.
the tradition of folklore surrounding that. And that one blew up. So I kind of started getting into a habit of making videos in that style where I'm dressed in very kind of flamboyant clothing
Mm.
and I'm jumping around. And I mean, I do have a background in performing arts. So of course I have that kind of performer instinct to want to like entertain. And I think a lot of people expect, I don't know if it's true, but I have this feeling that people have an expectation, and I think I see it in the fact that those videos always get more interaction. They always get more likes. They always get more comments and views. And so I always feel like I have to present my videos in that style now, or else people will get bored of it. And so there is a lot of kind of I don't know, expectations I'm placing upon myself as well that I'm reading into it. And it's quite it's interesting being a what do they call it these days? Influencer or something?
Influencer.
And influencing someone. Yes. But yeah, it's just bonkers sometimes.
So has there been, like, on that point about like stepping in? You raise a good point. I've heard this from many other people too. There's that point about the kind of relationship between people's projections and what you're putting out there, and almost having to cater to those projections in order to just be able to have that platform. Has anything surprised you with that?
I mean, I think people have a very unfair opinion of people like me who do put themselves out in the limelight to try and make these things more known. I mean, my entire intention, as I said, for doing this was to help people. I wanted people like me who were growing up in Wales and struggling to find anything to be able to Google Welsh witchcraft and not just, if you Google Welsh witchcraft right now on Google, um, of course. If you search it up anywhere online, the majority of what you will find is paywall academic texts
Yes.
that are written by people in universities or professors or historians and all these people. And it's very difficult to read these journals and things that do exist about Welsh witchcraft. And even if you do by some stroke of luck have access to these journals or have £100 to throw at one of the books that exist on Welsh witchcraft, it's then written in a very academic way. So, not everyone is very trained in reading academic texts. So it can be very difficult and very dry to navigate. And so I wanted to make it more accessible for people. And that was my whole thing. But then people kind of they look at my content, and I've noticed that a lot of people project their own idea of who I am onto me. They try and tell me that, like, I'm an attention seeker, or that I'm too flamboyant and that all I care about is likes and views. And I mean, there's a whole thing online in social media spaces within the witchcraft community, like there's a lot of shame towards like insta witches and witch talk and things like this, like, oh, they're the bane of our society, of our community, or something. And I've definitely felt the brunt of that. And it shocks me because, I mean, like I said, the whole point I did this was to help people. So it kind of feels like a bit of a punch in the chest when somebody says to you, like, you're only doing this for attention. And I mean, I do love attention, but it wasn't the whole intention of it. But then on top of that, it's people's expectations as well of what they want you to be and the standards they hold you to. I mean, I always kind of lived by the idea that you should hold people to the same standards that you hold yourself. So if you wouldn't expect someone to think this way of you, then you shouldn't put it on other people. But people expect me to get everything right 24/7 all the time. I have to kind of present the information perfectly. And I don't think a lot of people realize, I'm not an academic. I don't have a PhD in Welsh witch history. I'm just a Welsh witch who loves Wales. And so, yes, sometimes I will read these academic texts and I'll get it wrong. I won't understand it fully. And I'd rather be told, like, actually, that's not quite what it is, rather than hearing these condescending like DMs and videos that get sent my way of people critiquing my videos. And I think that was the biggest shock for me coming into the limelight, was seeing literal people getting mad at the fact that I have passion for something. And it made me really sad, really.
And that's
Because
happened. You've had like people actually, like, I'm not on TikTok, I'll be honest. So I don't see that aspect of that community, but you've had people actually take your videos and then do critiques of them.
yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it's for stupid reasons. So, in my opinion, for example, on TikTok, I made a video all about the witch hunts in Wales and how there weren't really any, and why that might be. And, like, there's a few historians who have spoken about it, like Ronald Hutton speaks about it in his book, The Witch, and Richard Sudger is the biggest one who talks about it everywhere. And these people are very much accredited historians who are very much respected in their field and seen as the authorities to go to. So I just repeat a lot of the information they have, but in my own style. And there was one section in that video where I said, um, you know, witch hunts didn't really happen in Wales as they did in England and most of Europe. And the same can be said for many parts of Ireland and Scotland. And I had this one lady who happened to be a historian. She had a PhD in history, and she jumped on and did like a duet or whatever it's called. Even though I'm TikTok, I'm not very queued up on how people do these things. But she basically shared my video and then shared her own video afterwards saying that I didn't know what I was talking about because I mentioned Scotland. And she was like, Scotland was the most notorious for witch hunts and they were horrible. So how can you say that Scotland didn't have witch hunts? And I was like, that's not what I meant. I meant there were parts of Scotland, especially in the Highlands, but it's a 60-second video and I don't have, I'm not writing an essay. I can't go into the nuance in a 60-second video. And if you want to read more, I have given sources in the video. But it's just, it kind of really threw me when somebody was so pent up about a tiny little throwaway comment that I made in a 60-second video where I went into so much detail about witch hunts in Wales and why there weren't as many. And oh, I don't know. And that's one of the instances that I got really upset because she was an academic, because she was someone who knows this stuff. You would think that she'd understand, like I can't get into the nuance of it all, especially because I'm not a historian. I'm just someone who likes witchcraft.
Yeah, well, that's a huge point right there, though. So much of, especially Wicca, has been couched in that academic kind of background because so many of the founders were either professors or they were people who were buying $300 textbooks and sitting in their studies at home with there's almost this like underlying culture within these spiritualities where if you're not an academic and you don't cite all these sources, suddenly you're invalid, right? Even if your sources do come, or then the other part of that dime where people who are saying and fabricating, like my great-great-great-grandmother Emmeline of, traditional witches going all the way back and they had the Book of Shadows, blah, 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 blah. It's like those two kind of weird binaries in the community where, you've got people who are not, they just pull it out of their ass, or then you've got these gatekeeping academics, and not all academics. I come from an academic background, not all of them, but certainly there are those types, right? So where do people fit in between, where it's more the experiential, I'm learning by practice, and I have done my research, but it's not going to be like academic level, perfection every single time. Where do people fit there,
Exactly. And I mean, I know I can't talk too much about the book that I'm writing at the minute, but I have to try to make that clear in this book because I will say, like exclusively here, the book is about the same kind of things I talk about on all of my socials. It's about the traditions of witchcraft that stem from Wales and such. And I try to make it very clear in that book that, I am at the end of the day just a practicing witch who comes from Wales who happens to know which sources to look at because I've got good friends who know how to point me in the good directions. And I credit a lot of the information that I know from certain sources. But I mean, one of the problems I came across while writing the book was I kept getting told by editors and stuff, oh, you haven't cast your net wide enough. You haven't, looked at enough sources. You haven't looked at enough material surrounding Welsh witchcraft. You keep referencing Sudgett and Hutton and all these people, but that's about it. You don't really go into too much detail other than that. Can you cast your net wider and speak about more sources that talk about Welsh witchcraft? And it's really difficult to get the point across that unless you have access to academic journals, or unless you are someone who can look at court cases and such, there really isn't anything out there apart from these two authors that might have written a little bit about it. And yeah, that was kind of a difficult one for me, and especially as well on the topic of kind of being almost tested by people to see how good you are at your knowledge. I made a video recently actually calling this behavior out, but I've been having a lot of people coming into my comment sections lately and tagging male creators who talk about the same things. Like they'll tag male creators who are witches and ask if they can verify what I'm saying. And it feels slightly I don't know, underhanded sometimes when somebody's literally tagging. So, for example, there are these Welsh pagan TikTokers that I know of who are actually American. They just happen to have trained via OBOD or other sources like that, and so they're druids and they live in America. And these male creators, I love them. I love their content, but so many of their fan base are coming into my comment section and trying to pick holes at the things I'm saying, and then tagging those creators to try and kind of fact check me. And it's, I don't know, there's a really unpleasant feeling behind that, especially when you consider, I think this is maybe my salty side coming out, but there's a part of me that goes, but I grew up in Wales, and I actually learned of these tales and stories and myths via experience of being taught them from my grandmother and my parents and my teachers at school, and I grew up with them surrounding me. And you're tagging Michael from Ohio, who learned about it in his late 20s, and asking him to fact check me. And there's, I don't know, I feel like there's a little bit of misogyny in there as well. And I don't know, it is definitely a gray area, like that middle ground of, I'm not an academic, but I'm just so passionate about this, and I want to share it. And I want the world to have more accessible access to that information, because I know that I struggled to find it.
It's that weird, and that I've heard of other people who have had that experience too, and I think that speaks a great deal to kind of the downside of becoming a platform and becoming an influencer, is that you're going to attract people who they like cult followers, really, and let's call it for what it is. Friends of mine in the States who write on similar, like in witchcraft circles or even spirituality in general, they come very much from the same perspective as you. I just wanted to help people and put some information out, and then suddenly these people come. I've seen it in my own work too. People come and they take what you're saying by rote. That says a lot about their own places in life, but it certainly doesn't help the atrocious behavior. It doesn't help the atrocious behavior. So let me ask you then, throughout that process then, all of your television appearances, writing a book, going through that, and thank you for sharing that a little bit. When the book is out, I'm going to have you back out to actually talk about the book. But throughout that process of the past 20 years, what have you learned about yourself?
Oh gosh.
I know, huge question there.
I think I've learned that I'm a very passionate individual who has very niche passions. And that I don't know, I definitely care deeply for the culture of magic that exists and permeates the landscape in which I come from. But I've also learned that, at the end of the day, I have to be happy with who I am as well in this community, and I have to be happy with presenting this information in a way that suits who I am. And yeah, coming out as trans, especially within the witchcraft community as it was difficult enough, because it's a community that's so filled with talks of fertility and biological sex that, when you come out as trans and you have kind of a very different worldview to that binary idea of how the world works, and the concepts of things such as the goddess and god just make no sense to you. I think I found a lot of solace in traditional witchcraft, and especially Swingavaredd and the magic of Wales, because it didn't really delve into that as much. It didn't delve into fertility and duality, which I kind of learned very early on that I didn't resonate with, that I didn't really click with. But yeah, I think coming to Welsh traditional magical practices, really helped me kind of come away from those mindsets and realize that there's a whole tradition and continuum of magic that exists and permeates my cultural landscape that doesn't include all those strange concepts of trying to tell you who you should be in your own body. And so I've kind of learned that being at one with my landscape and learning about the magic of my regional area, coming into contact with the spirits of my land and the spirits of my ancestors, has very much propelled my witchcraft to a whole other level, because I look back at the way I practiced before I started getting into the Welsh side of things, and I was I suppose, to say it bluntly, I was very much just a poser. I had a little altar set up in my room that was covered in eBay bought items that I didn't really know why was on my altar. Like, why do I have a chalice? Why do I have an athame? Things like this. Whereas now my practice has become so very well thought out, I suppose. And there's so much study that's gone into what I do now in my day-to-day life. And oh gosh. And I guess I've learned that I really do like sharing this information with the world, and I like getting people inspired. And I mean, that's a whole tenet that is a core principle in my practice, the invocation of inspiration. And I mean, I think a lot of Celtic pagans can relate to that because of the concepts of awen and things that permeates our practice. And that's really all I want to do, and why I've decided to write a book, why I decided to go on television, why I decided to put myself out there on social media, was because I want to inspire inspiration in people in the same way that characters like Miss Franklin and Chris and the Druids of Anglesey and the myths and legends and the teachers that I grew up with. I want to inspire people in the same way they inspired me, because without them, my practice would very much probably still be me sitting in my living room with a chalice, chanting, earth my body, water my blood, without really any substance behind what I'm doing. Why am I doing this? What is the context of it? Where does it all come from? And yeah, I suppose that's it really.
Love it. I love it. It's taking ownership for and responsibility
Yeah,
for your own spirituality.
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I think the only last question I have then is if, and you kind of touched on it there, if somebody's watching this channel and they may not necessarily be interested in Welsh witchcraft, but they've really taken in what you've been saying, what would you say for somebody on their own spiritual path? Let's say a young gay boy, a young trans kid in the rural countryside of Idaho, let's say, and they're interested in exploring their spirituality. What would you say to them?
I would say go with what resonates with you and your sense of self. Like, what exactly touches your soul? Because I think, like I said from the beginning, the landscape surrounding me inspired me so much as a child, and I was so very engrossed in myths and legends and tales. And I mean, fairies was a huge aspect of my upbringing. Like, people always saw me as the individual who loved fairies. And then it took me until my 20s, even though I'd been practicing throughout my teens, it took me until my 20s to go, I had such a deep interest in fairies. Why do fairies play no role in my witchcraft? Like, it's so strange. And I think looking at what piques your interest, looking at what exactly inspires and initiates inspiration within you, what makes your soul flutter, because I think a lot of people get drawn to magic, spirituality, witchcraft, whatever you might be interested in. They get drawn to it because they have this sense of wonder, but then they forget what else brings them that sense of wonder, because these things can overlap. If you have a connection with a certain hobby or interest, it can probably overlap with your spiritual practice in ways that you don't realize, and you don't have to follow the kind of cliche what is set out in the usual 101 books. As
Yes.
I said earlier, like, you don't have to set up your altar in that Wiccan way. I mean, if it resonates with you and you understand why you do it, but really question everything. And that's another thing I would always give as advice, is question everything. Why do I do what I do? Like, why do I go up on a cliff at 3 a.m. and chant to the sea? And why is that something that I did as a child but don't do now? Why is it nowadays I have an altar set up with a chalice and an athame? Why are those things there? Why are they important? What do they do? What do they actually represent beyond the generic representations that we're told in the books that they represent? Why are they there historically? Why are they there this? And also connect the region that you're in. I mean, I know that it's kind of difficult in America because of the connotations of appropriation and stuff that come into, especially living on land that was not your ancestors' land. I'm sure that's very difficult. But in the same breath, like, America and North America as a region in general, or Australia, they've been I suppose colonized is the right term for it, for so long now. And the people have lived on those lands for so long that there is a tradition of folk magic almost everywhere.
Yes.
And I touched upon this in a recent discussion that I had with someone else, where I mentioned, like, a lot of people are really inspired by Wales and Scotland and Ireland because of the fairy lore and the myth that we have embedded into the land. But people forget that that exists in America. And I don't just mean the Native American side of things. You don't have to appropriate it in the culture in order to see that lore and that magic that exists. I mean, I've become obsessed recently with the online series Hellier, which discusses, you know, like the cryptid lore that exists in America and things like this. And I think people forget that these things, you know, like the lore surrounding things like Kentucky goblins and Mothman, and these are just modern fairy lore happening right in front of you. And you can definitely be inspired by that in your practice if you want to connect with your region and you're not sure how to because you live on colonized land in some ways. But no matter where you are, I think it's important to get some sort of connection with the spirits and the very much living embodiment of the landscape itself, because you've grown up there and it means something to you. It's part of your bones, it's part of your blood. You know, you've ingested foods that come from there. It's very much part of who you are. So make it part of your spiritual practice. So yeah, question everything, go to what inspires you and connect with your land, I suppose.
Beautiful. Thank you. Mhara, when your book comes out, I definitely want to have you back on the show. Will you accept if I ask you to?
Absolutely, that would be lovely.
Wonderful. It's been a real pleasure talking today. Diolch yn fawr and nesta i ti.
Thank you very much. Diolch.